Welcome to the revolution. In case you don't know, it's been going on for a long time. Most people are just now starting to notice, though, because they're bombing all of these warehouses. But revolutions don't start with the toss of a Molotov cocktail. If you are at the point where people are tossing Molotov cocktails and setting plantations on fire, and by plantations, I mean factories and warehouses, you're already in the middle of it. This is not the beginning. We are going into the middle of it. It's the end of the beginning. Revolutions typically start with a feeling of general discontent and economic disparity. And how long has that been going on? One could argue that the revolution started when Obama left office and Trump got in office, but that's neither here nor there. That's semantics. In part one, I talked about the weak links that you need to watch out for during a revolution. These are the people that exist simply to distract you from the primary goal, which is progress by any means necessary. And I do mean by any fucking means necessary, even if that means tanking the US dollar in order to free us all from this capitalist hellscape. But the weak links are sent to distract you from the goal at hand, and those weak links, to recap, are men under patriarchy, white Americans, the religious, the house niggas, aka the corporate coons, aka the bootlickers. Go back and watch part one. And we also gave some examples of which revolutions are popping off all over the world. This is not just an American thing. This is happening all over the place. And we talked about class warfare here in America, the latest iteration of that being the warehouses and factories. But it was kicked off by Luigi Mangione. Shout out to my man. Oh, he's fine as fuck. Now I want to talk about the system's predictable responses to a revolting people. And when I say the system, I'm talking about the system of white heteronormative Christo-fascist patriarchy. I'm talking about capitalism. I'm talking about Western nations' outright abusive domination of the world's powers. I'm talking about the system. Okay. And when the system feels threatened by people like me and people like you, if you're watching this, they have very predictable responses. And so I've learned all of this about revolutions by reading A People's History of the United States. Reading this book is one of the best ways to fortify yourself for what's coming and for what's already here, because it gives you basically a play-by-play of how the American government is going to respond when you start getting on their ass. Okay. So let's start from the top. One of the most reliable weapons of the United States government when it comes to dividing the working class people is racism. Encouraging people to lean into racism distracts them from class consciousness, and it distracts them from the overall goal, which is the betterment of quality of life for all of humanity, which is why I said that white Americans are weak links during a revolution, because they are the most prone, more than any other group in the world, and I mean the world, white Americans are the most prone to falling for tactics of race baiting, racism. They will turn against their fellow working class Americans in a fucking heartbeat if it means supporting and withholding white supremacy, because it's so embedded in their DNA at this point that it's really easy to flip that switch and scare white people by dangling scary brown people in front of them. Okay. And so, to give you an example of how the system does this, during the strikes, the labor strikes of 1919, so this is immediately after World War I, there were some labor strikers that were striking U.S. Steel. So they were U.S. Steel workers, and they were striking for shorter hours and better pay, because these are people who were working like 12-hour days at least, 6 days a week at least, and they were getting paid like $10 a week, which was not a lot even in 1919. Sherman Service Incorporated, hired by the steel corporations in order to break this labor strike, they instructed their strike breakers to go into South Chicago, and they told them, quote, "We want you to stir up as much bad feeling as you possibly can between the Serbians and the Italians. Spread data among the Serbians that the Italians are going back to work. Urge them to go back to work or the Italians will get their jobs." And in addition to trying to turn the Serbs and the Italians against each other, they sent in more than 30,000 black workers who were brought into the area as strike breakers. Why were the black workers acting as strike breakers and betraying all of the strikers who were asking for better pay? Because these strikers betrayed them first because they're black and wouldn't let them into the labor union, which weakened their cause, because then those same people that they refused to let into their little labor union got shipped in and they took their jobs. So that's how racism can weaken a cause, and that's why it's one of the best tools for the system to use in order to diminish the power of a revolution. What also always happens is that the rich reliably blame the poor for problems that the rich created. And they also will implement like mass layoffs and force friction into the job market so that they can maintain their preferred balance of power, which is that they have all of the power and we have none. This is what happened after COVID and everybody started working from home and people started diving into their side projects and turning that into real hustles, and people started making more money. The power dynamics between workers and capitalists started to shift. And so that's why ever since COVID, the job market has been asked. There's a hiring freeze that they're not telling us about, because what they want is to take their power back. And the way that they take their power back is by making us so desperate for a job that we are willing to work for even lower wages, even longer hours, even worse conditions. And we still don't have federal paid leave. We still don't have maternity leave. We still don't have universal health care. What they're trying to do is inject desperation into the economy so that they can maintain their power as the employing capitalist. But to give you a historic example of how the rich will blame the poor for the richest problems, and how they'll force people to starve in order to maintain their riches. Howard Zinn writes, Henry Ford in March 1931, so we're fully into the Great Depression at this point. Henry Ford in March 1931 said the crisis was here because the average man won't really do... Hang on, let me start over. Henry Ford in March 1931 said the crisis was here because, quote, the average man won't really do a day's work unless he is caught and cannot get out of it. There is plenty of work to do if people would do it. What does that sound like? And then, a few weeks later, he laid off 75,000 workers. That's the hypocrisy of rich people. And to give you a little bit of perspective of what was going on in the country at the time, there were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it or to sell it. Warehouses were full of clothing, but people could not afford it. There were lots of houses, but they stayed empty because people couldn't pay the rent, had been evicted, and now lived in shacks in quickly formed Hoovervilles that were built on garbage dumps. And so all of these people have no clothes, they have no food, and it's not because the clothes and food didn't exist. It's because the capitalists didn't want to give it to them for free, because they were more concerned with making a profit than they were making sure people could survive. And that is a predictable response on behalf of the American government. And that's also what we're seeing today. To further demonstrate how little the American government gives a fuck about the people that live here and how little they've always given a fuck about the people that live here, I'm going to read you this anecdote. And I don't know if I said this already, but I'm reading from chapter 15 of A People's History of the United States, titled Self-Help in Hard Times. And it starts at the end of World War I and takes us through the Great Depression, through the New Deal. Okay, so to give you some context as to what the American government has historically done to a broken and abused and a desperate people, listen up. The anger of the veteran of the First World War, now without work, his family hungry, led to the march of the Bonus Army to Washington in the spring and summer of 1932. War veterans, holding government bonus certificates which were due years in the future, demanded that Congress pay off on them now, when the money was desperately needed. Again, this is in the middle of the Great Depression. And so they began to move to Washington from all over the country with wives and children or alone. They came in broken down old autos, stealing rides on freight trains or hitchhiking. They were miners from West Virginia, sheet metal workers from Columbus, Georgia, and unemployed Polish veterans from Chicago. One family, husband, wife, 3-year-old boy, spent 3 months on freight trains coming from California. Chief Running Wolf, a jobless Mescalero Indian from New Mexico, showed up in full Indian dress with bow and arrow. More than 20,000 came. More than 20,000 people raced to Washington in order to beg for food and jobs and money. More than 20,000 came. Most camped across the Potomac River from the Capitol on Anacostia Flats, where, as John Dos Passos wrote, quote, the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of newspaper, cardboard boxes, packing crates, bits of tin or tar paper roofing, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain scrapped together out of the city dump, end quote. The bill to pay off on the bonus passed the House, but was defeated in the Senate, and some veterans, discouraged, left. Most stayed. Some encamped in government buildings near the Capitol, the rest on Anacostia Flats, and President Hoover ordered the Army to evict them. So, just to recap, these are a bunch of World War I veterans who are literally starving to death during the Great Depression. And so they have these government bonus certificates that they can't cash out until years from now. They'll be dead by then. So what they did was they fled to Washington. They flocked to Washington in order to demand that Congress pay them their certificates now. And it's not that Congress didn't have the money. They just didn't want to give the money. And these are veterans. 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and 6 tanks assembled near the White House. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the operation, Major Dwight Eisenhower his aide. George S. Patton was one of the officers. MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue. They're waging war on these starving people. They weren't even doing anything. They were just camped there. And Hoover was like, get them the fuck out. MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue, used tear gas to clear veterans out of the old buildings, and set the buildings on fire. Then the Army moved across the bridge to Anacostia. Thousands of veterans, wives, children began to run as the tear gas spread. The soldiers set fire to some of the huts, and soon the whole encampment was ablaze. These are homeless people. When it was all over, 2 veterans had been shot to death, an 11-week-old baby had died, an 8-year-old boy was partially blinded by gas, 2 police had fractured skulls, and 1,000 veterans were injured by gas. So that's how the United States government responds to its people desperate and starving and begging for help. There are other anecdotes too. Indiana Harbor, Indiana, August 5th, 1931, 1,500 jobless men stormed the plant of the Fruit Growers Express Company here, demanding that they be given jobs to keep from starving. The company's answer was to call the city police, who routed the jobless with menacing clubs. Chicago, April 1st, 1932. 500 school children, most with haggard faces and in tattered clothes, paraded through Chicago's downtown section to the Board of Education offices to demand that the school system provide them with food. Boston, June 3rd, 1932. 25 hungry children raided a buffet lunch set up for Spanish War veterans during a Boston parade. 2 automobile loads of police were called to drive them away. Something else that you can count on when it comes to the system trying to protect itself from being destroyed, which is just a natural instinct, is that in America, and I'm speaking, all of this is from an American perspective. I can't speak on what other people have going on. That's not my expertise. But in America, what typically winds up happening, what always winds up happening, is that the blue side will play the good cop to the red side's bad cop. Okay, so I'm talking about the Democrats will play the good cop if the red guys have been bad, in order to reorganize and stabilize the capitalist system. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, when these socialist demands start coming from the people, and by socialist demands, I mean workers' rights protections, I mean civil rights, I mean women's rights, I mean pretty much anything that is a cry out, a demand for human rights is socialism. And so whenever these socialist demands start coming from the people, what winds up happening, and this is a historical pattern that I have picked up since reading this book, is one political party, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, will act a complete ass because of the president that's in office at the time. The president in office at the time, if the president is a Republican, so for instance, Herbert Hoover, he was a Republican, which at the time were considered the more liberals. But Herbert Hoover was the Republican, and it was under Herbert Hoover that the Great Depression was like not being fixed. It was under Herbert Hoover that all of those veterans were attacked on the White House lawn. And so what happens is that Herbert Hoover and the Republicans Republicans played the bad guy. And what happens is the blue side comes in and plays the good guy and gives us some breadcrumb concessions that they call massive radical reform in order to calm everybody down and quiet the fever pitch of socialism and the socialist demands. You see what I'm saying? And so they come in, they give you a little bit, they give you a little taste of what should have already been yours already. They give you a piece of the whole pizza that you're supposed to have. And because you're so broken, because you're so abused, and because you're so desperate, you hungrily accept it and you think that you've gotten what you came for when really they just gave you a breadcrumb, because what they don't want is changes that are so radical that they crumble the capitalist, Christo-fascist, heteronormative patriarchal system. That was a mouthful. Let me give you an example. So after Herbert Hoover pissed everybody off by basically abandoning the country during the first half of the Great Depression, the Democratic Party candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly, took office in the spring of 1933, and began a program of reform legislation which became famous as the New Deal. So when a small veterans march on Washington took place early in his administration, the same way that the veterans march took place under Herbert Hoover, but he attacked them all, what Franklin D. Roosevelt did instead was he went outside and greeted them and provided coffee, and then they met with one of his aides and went home. And so this was a sign of, hey, we're the good guys. We're on your side. But really, the only side they were on was preserving capitalism, because they knew that if they didn't do something fast, more and more people were going to start to see capitalism for the bullshit that it is. Because going back to something said earlier in the chapter, Howard Zinn writes, a socialist critic would go further and say that the capitalist system was by its nature unsound, a system driven by the one overriding motive of corporate profit and therefore unstable, unpredictable, and blind to human needs. The result of all that? Permanent depression for many of its people and a periodic crises for almost everybody. Capitalism, despite its attempts at self-reform, its organization for better control, was still in 1929 a sick and undependable system, and still in 2026 a sick and undependable system. And so in order to distract people from the fact that capitalism is fundamentally broken from the root, because it was never meant to support human life, what the blue side will do, what the good cop will do, is they will come in with two pressing needs: to reorganize capitalism in such a way to overcome the crisis and stabilize the system, and to head off the alarming growth of spontaneous rebellion that is happening because of the capitalist system breaking. And so what they're going to do, they're going to come in and they're going to do all of this reform just like FDR did throughout the Great Depression, like when he came into office and he started passing all of these laws, and I'll get into the laws in the next part, but he started passing all of these laws. And everybody was like, oh my God, thank God the government's actually helping. What the government was really trying to do is stop pissing y'all off so much that you started demanding socialism, because they can't have that. Is this making sense? So to recap, the predictable responses from the system that will happen during a revolution are, they're going to try to encourage racism very heavily, because that keeps us divided. They're going to blame the poor for the problems that the rich caused, and they're going to inject desperation into the job market in order to maintain their preferred balance of power. And then the blue side is going to play the good cop after the red side is done acting an ass, because the blue side and the red side all play for the same team, and that's capitalism. And that's not to say that you just shouldn't vote because it doesn't matter who you vote for, because blue and red are both capitalists. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that while voting blue will get us closer to the ultimate goal of liberation for all and the ultimate goal of socialism, you should always be skeptical of any blue politician, even the best blue politicians, because they are ultimately bought and paid for by the businessmen who are the ones that really run this country. And you cannot trust a politician to liberate you. Keep that in mind. Welcome to the revolution. It's time to get active. All that bitch ass crying that y'all be doing, it's time out for that. Now is the time for action. And I've just given you the playbook on what to watch out for as we move ahead. Yay!